Earl Mackenzie was reaching for the coffee pot when he heard his wife's voice drift through the screen door. "Don't worry, baby. The old fool will never suspect a thing." The aluminum pot slipped from his weathered hands, clattering against the farmhouse sink. Coffee grounds scattered across the white porcelain like dirt on fresh snow. Through the kitchen window, he could see Linda pacing the back porch, cell phone pressed to her ear, morning sunlight catching the gold bracelet he'd never seen before. "Costa Rica's perfect this time of year," she continued, her voice honey-sweet with excitement. "Just you, me, and all that money. He's so lonely since Tommy died. He'd believe anything I tell him." Earl's knees went weak. He gripped the counter, the rough wood grain cutting into his palm. 67 years old, and he was learning that sometimes the worst betrayals come with a kiss on the forehead and fresh-baked apple pie. But that was only the beginning. Earl stood frozen in that kitchen for what felt like an hour, though the clock above the refrigerator said it was only 3 minutes. 3 minutes for a man's world to crack clean through. Linda's voice had gone quiet outside. He heard her footsteps on the porch boards, the soft scrape of the wicker chair as she settled in to watch the sunrise like she did every morning. Like she was just his loving wife of 2 years, not a woman planning to rob him blind. The coffee grounds crunched under his work boots as he moved to the window. Linda sat with her back to him, auburn hair catching the light, wearing that yellow sundress he'd bought her for their anniversary. She looked so small and pretty there, sipping from the blue mug Tommy had made in high school pottery class, his dead son's mug, in the hands of a woman who called him a fool. Earl's chest tightened. He'd buried his first wife, Margaret, 4 years back. Buried his boy Tommy just 3 years after that, when the tractor rolled on that steep field Earl had told him to avoid. The loneliness afterward had been like living in a house with all the windows boarded up. When Linda started coming to church, started bringing him casseroles after the service, he'd felt something he thought was gone forever. Hope, companionship, a reason to shave every morning and iron his good shirts. 67 years old, and he'd been played like a fiddle. Earl slipped into the hallway and climbed the stairs, each step creaking familiar protests. In the bedroom, Linda's purse sat open on the dresser. His hands shook as he reached for her phone. The text messages hit him like physical blows. "Rick. Airport at 10 a.m. Tuesday. First class to San Jose. Can't wait to spend the old man's money on a real vacation. Linda. He signed the equity papers yesterday. $180,000 should last us months in paradise. Rick. What if he gets suspicious? Linda. He won't. Juan, he's so desperate for company he'd forgive anything. Pathetic, really." Earl set the phone down carefully, like it might explode. $180,000. The equity on the farm his grandfather had homesteaded in 1923. The land Tommy had died trying to work. In the distance, he heard the shower turn on. Linda, washing up before another day of playing the devoted wife. Earl walked into Tommy's old room and sat on the twin bed with its faded quilt. The walls still held his son's high school football trophies. The shelf still displayed the model airplanes they'd built together during those long winter evenings. "I'm sorry, boy," Earl whispered to the empty room. "I nearly gave it all away." He picked up Tommy's old baseball glove from the nightstand, the leather cracked and soft with age. Tommy had been a good judge of character, always could spot a phony from across a field. He'd only met Linda twice before the accident, but Earl remembered now how quiet he'd gotten afterward, how he'd asked Earl if he was sure about her. Earl had been irritated then, thought his son was just being protective. Now he wondered what Tommy had seen that he'd missed. Downstairs, the shower shut off. Soon Linda would be calling for him, asking why he hadn't started breakfast, why he looked tired, whether he was feeling all right. All that sweet concern, masking the countdown to Tuesday morning. Earl stood up, his knees popping like old branches. He had 3 days to figure out what to do, 3 days before his wife and her boyfriend disappeared with everything he had left. The question was, did he have any fight left in him? The answer came Tuesday morning when Earl followed his wife to town. He'd spent 3 days watching Linda play her part, the concerned wife fussing over his appetite, asking if he needed to see Doc Patterson about his tiredness, even suggesting they take a little trip together for his health. All while she packed expensive luggage he'd never seen before. Now Earl sat in his old Ford pickup across from Mabel's diner, engine ticking as it cooled, watching through the plate glass window. Linda sat in a corner booth with a man Earl had never met, but recognized instantly from his confident posture and expensive clothes. This had to be Rick. The man was younger than Earl by at least 15 years, with the kind of build that came from gym memberships rather than farm work. Dark hair slicked back, gold watch catching the diner's fluorescent lights. He leaned across the table toward Linda like they were discussing something urgent. Earl cracked his window to let in the cool morning air. The sounds of Main Street drifted in, the Methodist church bell chiming 9 o'clock, old Pete's lawnmower puttering in the distance, the diesel rumble of the morning freight, normal sounds of a normal day, while his world fell apart one booth at a time. Through the window, he watched Linda laugh at something Rick said, her hand covering her mouth the way she did when she was delighted. Earl had thought that laugh was for him. Now he knew better. Rick pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. Even from 50 yards away, Earl could see Linda nodding enthusiastically, her finger tracing something on the screen, probably pictures of Costa Rica beaches, or maybe bank account balances. A rap on his passenger window made Earl jump. Hank Peterson stood outside, wearing his usual coveralls and concerned expression. "You feeling all right, Earl? You look like you've seen a ghost." Earl rolled down the window. Hank was his nearest neighbor, a good man who'd retired from the First National Bank 5 years back. If anyone could help Earl understand what he was dealing with, it would be Hank. "Get in," Earl said. Hank climbed into the truck, bringing with him the smell of motor oil and Old Spice. He glanced toward the diner, then back at Earl. "That's your Linda in there, isn't it? With that fellow in the fancy shirt? You know him?" "Never seen him before, but I know the type." Hank's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd spent 30 years evaluating loan applications. City clothes, expensive watch, talking to a local woman in the back booth of Mabel's instead of out in the open. Nothing good comes from meetings like that. Earl's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What would you do, Hank? If you found out your wife was planning to take everything you had and run off with another man?" Hank was quiet for a long moment, watching Linda and Rick through the diner window. "I'd want to know exactly how much trouble I was in before I did anything else. Knowledge is power, Earl, especially when you're dealing with people who think they're smarter than you." As if summoned by their conversation, Rick stood up and walked to the diner's payphone near the restroom. Even through the glass, Earl could see him talking animatedly, his free hand gesturing. "Probably calling someone about travel arrangements," Hank murmured. "Or maybe checking on money transfers. Men like that don't do anything without backup plans." Linda remained in the booth, but now she looked nervous, glancing around the diner like she expected to see someone watching. Her gaze swept past the pickup without recognition. Earl's truck was common enough in farm country that it blended into the background. When Rick returned to the table, he was frowning. He said something that made Linda's face go pale, then pulled out a roll of cash and dropped it on the table. Linda counted it quickly, nodded, and tucked it into her purse. "Earl," Hank said quietly, "I think you need to know that your Linda came into the bank last week. Asked a lot of questions about transferring large sums, about international wire regulations, claimed it was for a family emergency." Earl's stomach dropped. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Bank privacy, mostly, but also—" Hank hesitated. "Also because I hoped I was wrong about what I was seeing. You've been through enough heartache, friend. I didn't want to add to it without being sure." Through the window, Rick was standing again, this time pulling Linda to her feet. They embraced, not the polite hug of acquaintances, but the practiced intimacy of longtime lovers. Earl watched his wife kiss another man in broad daylight, 40 yards from the church where they'd been married. "I need to get home," Earl said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Earl, wait." But Earl was already starting the engine. He'd seen enough for one morning. More than enough. As he pulled away from the curb, he caught one last glimpse of Linda in his rearview mirror. She was walking toward a silver BMW parked behind the diner. Rick's car, no doubt, Expensive, flashy, everything Earl's old Ford wasn't. By the time he reached the farm, Earl's hands had stopped shaking. The fury was settling into something colder, more focused. Linda thought she was dealing with a lonely old fool who'd never suspect her game. She was about to learn how wrong she was. That evening, Earl sat on his porch as the sun painted the wheat fields gold. Linda was inside, humming while she cooked dinner, probably celebrating her upcoming windfall. The sound made his skin crawl. Hank's truck pulled into the gravel drive at 7 sharp, headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Earl had called him after Linda went upstairs to rest, though she'd really been on the phone again, speaking in whispers that carried through the old farmhouse walls. "Brought you something," Hank said, climbing the porch steps with a manila envelope under his arm. He settled into the wicker chair that used to be Margaret's favorite, the one Linda had claimed as her own. Earl opened the envelope and whistled low. Bank records, credit reports, property searches, all with Rick Torelli's name at the top. "How'd you get all this?" 30 years in banking teaches you who to call." Hank pulled out his reading glasses. "Your boy Rick's been busy. 3 previous marriages, all to women over 50, all ending in mysterious financial troubles. 2 fraud charges in Florida that somehow got dropped. Current debts to some very unpleasant people in Kansas City." Earl studied a grainy photograph paper-clipped to one of the reports. Rick standing outside a casino, looking nervous, talking to 2 men in expensive suits. Gambling? Horses, cards, sports betting. The man's addicted to losing money he doesn't have. Hank flipped through more pages. "According to my contact in Missouri, he owes serious people over 200,000. The kind of people who break things when they don't get paid." Inside the house, Linda's laughter tinkled through the screen door. She was probably texting Rick about their romantic evening plans while her husband sat 10 feet away. "There's more," Hank said quietly. "I made some calls about Linda, too." Earl's jaw tightened. "What kind of calls?" "Remember Harold Zimmer from over in Millerville? Died 2 years back?" "Sure. Nice fellow. Heard he remarried late in life." "To a woman named Linda Caldwell?" Auburn hair, sweet smile, about 50 years old. She disappeared right after the funeral, along with Harold's life insurance and the deed to his farm. Hank met Earl's eyes. "The police report lists her real name as Linda Marie Torelli." The porch boards creaked under Earl's shifting weight. Torelli. Rick's ex-wife. Though ex might be overstating it. They never legally divorced. She's been running cons on lonely widowers for years, with Rick handling the cleanup and intimidation. Hank folded his glasses. "Earl, you're not her first target. You're just her latest." A screen door slammed somewhere down the road, followed by children's laughter and a mother calling them in for baths. Normal sounds from normal lives, while Earl's world revealed itself as an elaborate lie. What's their game plan? Best I can figure, they drain your accounts, forge your signature on property transfers, then disappear. If you get suspicious or try to fight back, Hank gestured toward the photo of Rick with the casino men. Well, Rick's got experience with people who ask too many questions. Earl stood up and walked to the porch railing, staring out at the fields Tommy had died working. Somewhere out there was the spot where the tractor had rolled, where Earl had found his son's broken body and cursed God for taking the wrong Mackenzie. "You know what hurts most?" Earl said. "I actually thought she cared about me. Thought maybe I'd found someone to grow old with, someone to share Sunday dinners and evening walks." He gripped the railing until his knuckles went white. "Turns out I was just a paycheck with a heartbeat." "Earl? No, let me finish." Earl turned around and Hank was surprised by the steel in his eyes. "They picked the wrong old fool this time, Hank. I may be lonely and I may be grieving, but I'm not helpless. I spent 2 years in Korea watching men die because they underestimated the enemy. I learned some things about patience and planning." The screen door opened, and Linda stepped onto the porch, wearing Earl's favorite blue dress and carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea. "Oh, hello, Hank. I didn't know you were coming by." Her smile was radiant, perfect. "Earl, honey, you didn't tell me we were having company." "Just talking farming with an old friend," Earl said, accepting the tea. Hank was telling me about some problems with property theft in the county. Seems there's been some folks taking advantage of elderly farmers. Linda's smile faltered for just a moment. How awful. Good thing you have neighbors who look out for each other. Yes, Earl said, looking directly at her. Good thing. After Linda went back inside, Hank gathered his papers. What are you planning to do? Earl sipped his tea, tasting sweetness and deception in equal measure. I'm going to give them exactly what they want, Hank. I'm going to be the perfect victim, confused, trusting, easy to fool. Earl, that's dangerous. Sometimes the best way to catch a snake is to let it think it's already won. Earl's voice carried a quiet authority that reminded Hank why Earl had made sergeant in Korea while barely out of his teens. But I'm going to need your help. And maybe a few other friends who remember what it means to look out for family. Hank nodded slowly. What do you need? Earl looked toward the kitchen window, where Linda was washing dishes and probably planning how to spend his money. I need them to believe they've got me right where they want me. And then I need to remind them that old dogs sometimes have the sharpest teeth. By Thursday morning, Earl realized they weren't just planning to rob him, they were planning to kill him. The first sign came when he walked out to check his truck before his weekly trip to town. The brake pedal went straight to the floor with a soft hiss of escaping fluid. Earl knelt beside the front wheel and found the line cut clean through, not worn or damaged, but sliced with something sharp. His hands shook as he called Hank from the barn phone, keeping his voice low. They've escalated. What happened? Brake line's been cut. If I'd driven to town this morning. Earl didn't finish the sentence. The hill road into Millerville had a steep grade and a sharp turn at the bottom. A truck with no brakes wouldn't make that corner. Jesus, Earl, we need to call the sheriff. With what proof? Could have been vandals, could have been an accident. Rick's too smart to leave fingerprints. Earl peered through the barn window toward the house where Linda was hanging laundry on the back porch like nothing had happened. No, they want to play games. Let's play. That afternoon, Earl drove Hank's borrowed pickup to Miller's auto shop, where young Bobby Miller had been fixing farm equipment since high school. Brake line was definitely cut, Bobby confirmed, sliding out from under Earl's Ford. Clean slice, right through the metal. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Earl nodded, unsurprised. Fix it up, Bobby, and maybe keep this between us for now. Sure thing, Mr. Mackenzie. But maybe you should think about who might want to hurt you. I know exactly who, Earl thought, but he just thanked Bobby and headed home. The second sign came that evening. Earl had developed the habit of checking his property after dark, old military instincts kicking in. He was walking the fence line when he spotted light moving through his kitchen window. Someone was inside the house, and it wasn't Linda. She was at her book club in town, or so she'd claimed. Earl crept closer, staying in the shadows of the oak trees Margaret had planted 30 years ago. Through the kitchen window, he could see a man's silhouette moving systematically through his papers, photographing documents with a phone camera. Rick. The man was methodical, professional. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Insurance papers, bank statements, the will Earl had updated after marrying Linda. Rick even checked inside Earl's medicine cabinet, probably cataloging pills that might explain away an accidental overdose. Earl eased back into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. In Korea, he'd learned to recognize when the enemy was preparing for a final assault. This felt exactly the same. Back at the barn, Earl called Hank again. They're not planning to wait for Costa Rica. They're moving the timeline up. What makes you say that? Earl described what he'd seen. Rick's been through all my papers, probably copying everything. That's not the behavior of someone planning a simple theft. That's someone preparing to explain why Earl Mackenzie won't be needing his money anymore. We need to get you out of there. No. Earl's voice was firm. Running makes me look guilty, and it gives them time to disappear. Besides, where would I go? This farm is all I have left of Tommy and Margaret. I'm not abandoning it because some city boy thinks he can intimidate an old soldier. The next morning brought the third sign. Earl was feeding the chickens when he heard voices from the front porch. Linda was talking to someone, her tone nervous and urgent. Told you he's starting to ask questions. Yesterday he wanted to know why I've been going to town so much. Relax. Rick's voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who'd never met real resistance. Old farmers are suspicious by nature, doesn't mean he knows anything. But what if he does? What if he's been following us or, Linda? The temperature in Rick's voice dropped 20 degrees. We've been through this. You do your job, I'll handle the complications. That's how this works. Earl crept closer to the living room window, staying below the sill. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see Rick standing over Linda, one hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that looked protective but felt threatening. The brake line was a good start, Rick continued. But if that doesn't work, we move to Plan B. A lonely old man with heart problems, living in an isolated farmhouse, taking too many medications. These things happen. Linda's face went pale. You said we wouldn't have to. I said we'd try to avoid it. But if he keeps digging, keeps asking questions, keeps making our lives difficult. Rick shrugged. Well, accidents happen on farms all the time. Tractors roll over, old men fall down stairs, gas leaks cause explosions. Earl's blood ran cold. They weren't just planning murder. They were planning it to look like an accident, with Linda playing the grieving widow who inherits everything. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Linda whispered. Rick's hand moved from her shoulder to the back of her neck, his fingers tightening slightly. You'll do whatever I tell you to do, because if you don't, those nice people in Kansas City are going to come looking for their money, and they won't care that you're just a woman who got in over her head. Earl had heard enough. He backed away from the window, his mind racing through tactical options. In Korea, when the enemy had superior numbers and position, you didn't meet them head on. You found their weaknesses and exploited them. Rick's weakness was his arrogance. He thought Earl was just another confused old man, easy to manipulate and eliminate. Linda's weakness was her fear. She was in this partnership with Rick, but she was terrified of both the violence and the consequences. And Earl's advantages? He knew the terrain. He had allies Rick didn't know about, and most importantly, he had nothing left to lose except his life, which meant he could take risks that might destroy a man with more to protect. That afternoon, Earl drove to the cemetery where Tommy and Margaret rested under matching headstones. He knelt between their graves, his arthritic knees protesting against the cold ground. I'm sorry, he whispered to Tommy's grave. I let loneliness make me stupid, and now I might lose everything you worked for. But I promise you this, son, if I don't make it through this, I'll go down fighting. And that woman won't get to spend one dime of what belongs to this family. A warm breeze stirred the grass around the headstones, carrying the smell of approaching rain and the distant sound of church bells. Earl stood up, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked back to his truck with the measured pace of a man who'd made his choice. Rick and Linda thought they were hunting a helpless old farmer. They were about to discover they'd cornered a soldier instead. Earl found the key on Friday morning, tucked inside Tommy's old tackle box like a message from beyond the grave. He'd been going through his son's belongings, partly for comfort and partly to inventory anything valuable that Linda might try to claim. The key was wrapped in a piece of paper with Tommy's handwriting. Dad, if you're reading this, something happened to me and you need protection. First National, Box 247. Use this to keep the vultures away. Love, T. Earl's hands trembled as he read the note twice, then a third time. Tommy had been worried about something before the tractor accident. Worried enough to rent a safety deposit box and leave his father a cryptic message. 20 minutes later, Earl sat across from Mrs. Patterson at the First National Bank, the key burning a hole in his shirt pocket. She was Hank's replacement, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd handled Earl's banking for years. I'll need to see identification and verify the signature card, she said, leading him into the vault's climate-controlled silence. Your son rented this box 3 months before his death, said it was for important family documents. The box was smaller than Earl expected but heavier than it looked. Inside, he found a manila envelope thick with papers and a coffee can wrapped in plastic. The can held $20,000 in cash, neatly bundled with rubber bands. But the papers hit harder than the money. Tommy had been investigating Linda. The first document was a background check dated just 2 weeks after Earl had started dating her. Tommy had hired a private investigator, probably cost him most of his savings, and the results painted a picture that made Earl's blood run cold. Linda Marie Caldwell, also known as Linda Torelli, Linda Brennan, and Linda Walsh. 4 previous marriages to men over 60, 3 unexplained deaths, 1 suspicious disappearance, insurance claims totaling over $1 million across 15 years. There were photographs, Linda with Harold Zimmer at a church social, looking exactly as she did with Earl. Linda with an elderly man named Frank Walsh outside a courthouse in Nebraska. Linda in a black dress at Frank's funeral 6 months later. And there were copies of death certificates, heart attack, fall downstairs, accidental drowning in a farm pond. Earl's vision blurred. He leaned against the vault wall, the cold metal helping to steady him. The second envelope contained letters. 3 of them, written in Tommy's careful handwriting. Dad, I know you think I'm being overprotective, but something's not right about Linda. I asked around at the church social where you met her. Nobody remembers seeing her before that night. She just appeared, like she was hunting for something. Or someone. Dad, I hired that investigator. I know it was expensive, but I had to know. The woman you're dating has been married 4 times to men just like you. Lonely widowers with property and savings. It never ends well for the husbands. Dad, if something happens to me before I can show you this evidence, promise me you'll be careful. She's dangerous, and she's not working alone. There's a man who follows her from town to town. They're professionals, Dad. Don't trust either of them, and don't let them know you're suspicious until you're ready to act. Earl wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. His son had died trying to protect him, leaving behind a roadmap to survival. The third envelope contained contact information for lawyers, investigators, and something that made Earl's heart skip. A business card for Deputy Sarah Chen of the County Sheriff's Department with a handwritten note from Tommy. She specializes in elder fraud. She'll believe you when you're ready to talk. Earl gathered everything carefully, his military training kicking in. Intelligence was only valuable if you could act on it, and action required planning. Outside the bank, he sat in his truck and dialed the number on Deputy Chen's card. "This is Earl Mackenzie," he said when she answered. "My son Tommy left me your number. I think I'm about to need your help." Tommy Mackenzie's father? Her voice sharpened with interest. "He came to see me a few months back, said he was worried about his dad getting involved with a dangerous woman. I told him to bring you in when you were ready to listen. I'm ready now. Where are you?" "First National parking lot." "Stay there." "I'll be right over." Deputy Chen arrived in an unmarked car, a compact Asian woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. She slid into Earl's passenger seat and looked over Tommy's evidence with professional focus. "Your son was thorough," she said finally. "And he was right to be scared. We've been tracking Linda Torelli for 2 years, but she's careful about staying just shy of federal charges. Local jurisdictions don't talk to each other enough, so she slips through the cracks." "What about the deaths?" "Suspicious but unprovable. She's smart about choosing targets. Elderly men with health problems, isolated locations, situations where accidents seem plausible." Chen flipped through the photographs. "But this time might be different. This time we have advance warning, thanks to Tommy." Earl felt something loosen in his chest. He wasn't facing this alone anymore. "What do I need to do?" "Go home. Act normal. Let them think their plan is working." Chen pulled out a small device that looked like a hearing aid. "This is a recording device, FBI quality, completely undetectable. Wear it all the time. We need them to incriminate themselves on tape." "What about the physical danger? They've already tampered with my truck." "We'll have surveillance on your property starting tonight. Not close enough for them to notice, but close enough to respond if things go wrong." Chen met his eyes. "Earl, I need you to understand something. What you're doing is dangerous. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again if they feel cornered." Earl thought about Tommy's letters, about the promise he'd made at the cemetery, about the farm his grandfather had built and his son had died protecting. "Deputy, I've been shot at by better men than Rick Torelli. If my boy could plan all this to protect me from beyond the grave, I think I can handle a couple of small-town grifters." Chen smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "Tommy said you were a Korean War veteran. He was proud of that. He was a good son, better than I deserved." Earl pocketed the recording device. Now let's make sure these parasites don't profit from his death. As Earl drove home, Tommy's $20,000 secured in his jacket and Deputy Chen's recorder hidden in his ear, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The calm confidence of a soldier with good intelligence and a clear mission. Linda and Rick thought they were dealing with a confused old man mourning his dead son. They had no idea that dead son was still looking out for his father. The phone calls started Saturday night. Earl was washing dinner dishes when the house phone rang. He dried his hands on the dish towel and answered on the fourth ring. "Is this Earl Mackenzie?" The voice was gravelly, unfriendly. "Who's asking?" "Someone who's looking for Rick Torelli. Word is he's been spending time at your place." Earl's grip tightened on the receiver. "Don't know anyone by that name." "Sure you do, old man. He's the one screwing your wife while planning to steal your money." A rough chuckle. "Tell him Marcus called. Tell him his Kansas City friends are getting impatient." The line went dead. Earl set the phone down carefully, his hands steady despite the chill running down his spine. In the living room, Linda was watching her evening shows, laughing at a sitcom like she didn't have a care in the world. The recording device in his ear captured every sound. The second call came an hour later. Different voice, same message. Rick owed money to dangerous people, and they were running out of patience. They knew he was in Missouri. They knew he was using an old farmer as cover. By Sunday morning, Earl had received 5 calls. As the last one was different. "Mr. Mackenzie, this is Jim Calloway from the Millerville Hotel. I've got a guest here who's been charging things to your credit card. Says he's your son-in-law. Anyway, the card was declined on a pretty big bar tab, and he's asking if you can come sort it out." Earl felt his jaw clench. "What's the guest's name?" "Rick Torelli, nice enough fellow, but he seems to be living pretty high on the hog. Champagne, room service, the works." "I'll be right there." Earl found Rick in the hotel bar at 11 a.m., drinking what looked like his third Bloody Mary and flirting with a waitress young enough to be his daughter. The man was dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Earl's truck payment: silk shirt, leather jacket, gold chain visible at his throat. "Earl!" Rick stood up with the exaggerated enthusiasm of someone trying too hard to seem pleased. "Thanks for coming down." "Little misunderstanding with the credit card." "I didn't give you permission to use my credit card." Rick's smile faltered slightly. "Linda said it would be okay, just until I get some things sorted out." He leaned closer, and Earl could smell expensive cologne mixed with alcohol. "Between you and me, I'm helping Linda plan a surprise for you. A little getaway, just the two of you." The recording device caught every word. "What kind of getaway?" "Somewhere tropical. She wants to treat you nice, Earl. Show her appreciation for everything you've done for her." Rick clapped Earl on the shoulder with false friendship. "You're a lucky man, having a woman who cares about you that much." Earl looked around the hotel bar, the crystal glasses, the leather seats, the bills sitting on the table that probably equaled a month of his Social Security. Must be expensive, planning surprises. Well, you know how women are. They want everything perfect. Rick picked up his drink again. "But don't worry about the money, Earl. Once Linda inherits everything, you'll never have to worry about expenses again." The words hung in the air like poison gas. "Inherits what?" Rick's eyes sharpened, but his smile never wavered. "Sorry, poor choice of words. I meant once you two combine your assets. Marriage is a partnership, right?" Earl paid Rick's bar tab, $347 for 3 hours of drinking, and drove home in silence. The recording device had captured everything. Rick's admission about using the credit card, his reference to Linda's inheritance, his casual mention of tropical getaways. But the real shock came when Earl arrived home and found his living room torn apart. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, papers scattered across the floor. Linda stood in the middle of the chaos, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Earl, thank God you're home. Someone broke in while I was at church." They went through everything: your desk, the bedroom, even the kitchen cabinets. Earl surveyed the damage with a soldier's eye. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone had been searching for something specific. Papers, probably. Documents that might interfere with their plans. "Did you call the sheriff?" I was so scared I didn't know what to do. Maybe we should just clean up and not make a fuss. I mean, they didn't take anything valuable. They took my peace of mind, Earl said quietly. And in my experience, people who break into a man's home once tend to come back. That evening, Hank came over to help repair the damage. While Linda was upstairs, resting from the trauma, Hank pulled Earl aside. This wasn't a burglary, Hank whispered. Look at what they searched and what they ignored. They went through your papers, but left your television, your mother's silver, even the cash in your kitchen jar. Earl nodded. They were looking for Tommy's evidence, which means they know you know something. As if summoned by their conversation, Earl's phone rang. He recognized the gravelly voice from the night before. Mr. Mackenzie, this is Marcus from Kansas City. I think we need to have a conversation about your house guest. See, Rick owes us a considerable amount of money, and we understand he's about to come into some inheritance. We'd like to make sure there are no complications with that arrangement. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. And here's what's going to happen. You're going to make sure Rick gets what he's promised, when he's promised it. Because if you don't, well, the voice turned ugly. Farm accidents are terrible things. Tractors roll over, old men fall into grain silos, gas leaks cause explosions. Hate to see something happen to a nice old fellow like yourself. Earl hung up without responding, his hands steady despite the threat. Hank was watching him with concern. Earl? They're not just planning to kill me for the money, Earl said quietly. They owe money to killers, and those killers know about their plan. Now I'm caught in the middle of a war between criminals. Outside, a car engine started and pulled away from the house. Through the window, Earl caught a glimpse of taillights disappearing down the county road. Someone had been watching them, listening to their conversation. The trap was closing from multiple directions. Rick and Linda wanted him dead for his money. The Kansas City criminals wanted him dead to protect their investment. And somewhere in the darkness, unknown eyes were watching his every move. Earl touched the recording device in his ear and made a decision. It was time to stop being the hunted and start being the hunter. But first, he had one more call to make. Earl called Deputy Chen at midnight. They're accelerating the timeline, he said quietly into the kitchen phone, watching Linda sleep upstairs through the ceiling. Kansas City criminals are pressuring them for money, and they just ransacked my house looking for evidence. Are you safe? For now, but they're getting desperate. Earl described the threatening phone calls, Rick's hotel expenses, and the professional nature of the home invasion. How much evidence do you need? Enough to convince a jury. Keep the recorder on and try to get them talking about their plans. Specific plans, dates, methods, financial details. After hanging up, Earl sat at his kitchen table and planned like the soldier he'd once been. In Korea, the key to surviving an ambush was turning the enemy's advantages into weaknesses. Rick and Linda thought they held all the cards. Earl's loneliness, his trust, his isolation. But they'd made two critical mistakes. They'd underestimated their target. And they'd gotten greedy enough to bring outside criminals into the equation. Monday morning brought the opportunity Earl had been waiting for. Linda came downstairs wearing her church dress and carrying an overnight bag. I need to visit my sister in Springfield, honey. She's having surgery tomorrow, and I should be there. Earl knew Linda didn't have a sister in Springfield. Deputy Chen had confirmed that Linda's entire family history was fabricated, but he played his part perfectly. Of course, dear. Family comes first. How long will you be gone? Just 2 nights. I'll be back Wednesday morning. Linda kissed his forehead with practiced affection. Will you be okay here alone? I've been taking care of myself for 67 years. I think I can manage 2 more nights. After Linda left, Earl called in sick to his part-time job at the feed store and spent the day preparing. He installed the hidden cameras Hank had borrowed from his security company friend. He tested the recording device and made sure his phone was fully charged. Most importantly, he called his lawyer and made one critical change to his will. Linda didn't know it yet, but she was about to inherit absolutely nothing. Tuesday evening, Rick showed up at Earl's door with a bottle of expensive whiskey and his most charming smile. Thought you might like some company while Linda's away, Rick said, settling into Earl's living room like he owned it. Gets lonely in these old farmhouses. Kind of you. Earl accepted a glass of whiskey he had no intention of drinking. The recording device was active, and he could see the red light of the hidden camera blinking from behind the bookshelf. You know, Earl, Linda's told me so much about you. Korean War veteran, successful farmer, devoted husband and father. Rick's tone was respectful, but his eyes were calculating. Must have been hard, losing your son so young. Tommy was everything to me. I'm sure he was. And I'm sure he'd want you to be happy in your remaining years. Rick leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That's why Linda and I want to help you enjoy your retirement. What kind of help? Well, managing finances can be complicated for someone your age. All those accounts and investments and tax implications. Rick sipped his whiskey. Linda could handle all that for you. Take the burden off your shoulders. Earl nodded slowly, playing the confused old man perfectly. That's thoughtful of her. She loves you, Earl. Really loves you. But she's also practical. Rick's smile sharpened. She knows that at your age, with your health problems, it's important to have plans in place. What health problems? Rick backpedaled smoothly. Oh, just the normal things. Blood pressure, heart concerns, the medications you take. Linda mentioned you've been forgetting things lately. Earl's blood chilled. He wasn't taking any medications, and his last physical had shown perfect health for a man his age. Rick was laying groundwork for something. I don't remember forgetting anything. See? That's exactly what Linda was worried about. Rick stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a small white pill in his palm. She asked me to make sure you take your evening medication. For your heart. The recording device captured everything. Rick's lies about Earl's health, his insistence on medication Earl had never been prescribed, his casual mention of Linda's love while planning Earl's death. I don't take heart medication. Dr. Patterson prescribed it last month. Linda's been giving it to you in your coffee, but she was worried you'd forget while she was away. Rick held out the pill. Just a small dose. Nothing that will hurt you. Earl looked at the white tablet, knowing it was probably enough sedative to knock him unconscious, or worse. What happens after I take it? You get a good night's sleep, and in the morning you'll feel much better. Rick's voice was hypnotically reasonable. Linda will be so relieved to know you're taking care of yourself. Earl reached for the pill, then stopped. You know, Rick, I'm curious about something. How long have you and Linda been planning this? Rick's hand froze. Planning what? The murder, the theft, the fake marriage to a lonely old fool who'd be too grateful for companionship to ask hard questions. Earl's voice remained conversational, but his eyes were hard as flint. How long have you been planning to kill me? The room went silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Rick's charming mask slipped, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Linda's not visiting a sister in Springfield. She's establishing an alibi while you drug me and stage an accident. The Kansas City criminals get their money, you two get my farm and life insurance, and Earl Mackenzie becomes another sad story about an elderly widower who died alone. Rick set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care. When he looked up, the pretense was gone completely. You're smarter than we gave you credit for. Smart enough to know you've been planning this since the day Linda walked into my church. Smart enough to know about Harold Zimmer and Frank Walsh and all the other lonely old men you've murdered. Earl stood up slowly, his hands steady. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Rick smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who'd finally dropped his disguise. Well, Earl, I guess we'll just have to move to Plan B a little earlier than expected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small revolver. The thing about farm accidents, Rick said conversationally, is that they can happen any time of day or night. Elderly man surprised by intruders, tries to defend himself, gets shot in the struggle. Very tragic, very believable. Earl looked at the gun without flinching. In Korea, he'd had enemy weapons pointed at him more times than he could count. Fear was a luxury he'd learned to set aside when survival was at stake. One problem with your plan, Rick. What's that? Earl smiled for the first time since the conversation began. You're not the only one who's been recording tonight. Rick's gun hand wavered for just a moment. What are you talking about? Federal recording device, courtesy of the Sheriff's Department, been documenting every word you've said tonight. Earl tapped his ear. Your confession about the murders, the drugging, the planned farm accident, all of it's being transmitted to Deputy Chen as we speak. You're bluffing. Try me. The sound of car doors slamming outside answered for him. Rick spun toward the window, and through the curtains they could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Sheriff's Department! Surround the house! Rick's face went white. He swung the gun back toward Earl, his hand shaking now with panic instead of confidence. You set me up, old man. No, Earl said quietly. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself. The front door burst open, and Deputy Chen appeared with two other officers, weapons drawn. Drop the gun, Torelli. It's over. For a moment, Rick looked like he might fight. The gun trembled in his grip, pointed at Earl's chest. Then his shoulders sagged and the weapon clattered to the floor. Richard Torelli, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder fraud, identity theft, and attempted homicide. Chen's voice was crisp and professional as she cuffed him. You have the right to remain silent. As Rick was led away, Earl sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 67 years. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and the strange, hollow feeling of a job finally finished. You did good, Chen said, sitting across from him. That recording will put him away for life. Maybe Linda too, when we pick her up. Where is she? Kansas City, actually, trying to negotiate with Rick's creditors. Apparently she thought she could convince them to give her more time by promising them your money. Chen shook her head. These people never learn that criminals don't make good business partners. An hour later, after the statements were given and the evidence cataloged, Earl found himself alone in his living room. The whiskey glasses still sat on the coffee table, the expensive bottle Rick had brought gleaming in the lamplight. Earl picked up Rick's glass and carried it to the kitchen sink, washing away the last traces of the evening's deception. The phone rang as he was drying the glass. Earl, it's Hank. I just heard on the scanner. Are you all right? I'm fine, Hank. Better than fine, actually. Want some company? Dorothy's making coffee. That sounds perfect. Hank and Dorothy arrived 20 minutes later, followed by Pastor Williams and his wife. Then Mabel from the diner, then half a dozen other neighbors who'd heard the news on the police scanner. Before Earl knew it, his living room was full of people bringing food and support and the kind of authentic care that Linda had only pretended to offer. I feel like such a fool, Earl said to the assembled group, letting loneliness cloud my judgment, nearly losing everything Tommy worked for. Now you stop that, Dorothy Peterson said firmly. Love makes fools of us all, at every age. The difference is that you were smart enough to ask for help when you needed it. Pastor Williams nodded. Pride goes before the fall, but wisdom knows when to lean on community. You did the right thing, Earl. What happens next? Mabel asked. With the legal stuff, I mean. Deputy Chen, who'd stayed to finish paperwork, looked up from her notes. Rick will likely get life without parole. Federal charges for the pattern of murders across state lines. Linda's looking at 20 to life, depending on how much cooperation she provides about previous victims. And Earl's money? Safe. The equity loan was fraudulent, so the bank has to void it. Earl's assets are protected. Chen smiled. Plus, there might be some recovery from their other victims' estates. The FBI's been building a case against these two for years. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home with promises to check on him tomorrow, Earl found himself standing on his porch with Hank. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance, a screech owl called from the old oak grove. You know what's funny? Earl said. What's that? I spent 2 years thinking I was the luckiest man alive, getting a second chance at love. Turns out I was lucky in a completely different way. How so? Earl looked out at the fields that had been in his family for 4 generations, the land Tommy had died protecting, the legacy that would now pass safely to Tommy's children. I was lucky enough to have a son who loved me enough to keep protecting me even after he was gone. Lucky enough to have neighbors who cared more about my welfare than a woman who shared my bed. Lucky enough to discover that sometimes being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. Hank nodded thoughtfully. You thinking about trying again? Dating, I mean? Earl was quiet for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his land, wind through wheat stubble, cattle settling for the night, the distant hum of the grain elevator. Maybe someday, he said finally. But next time, I'll trust my son's judgment over my own loneliness. And I'll remember that the best relationships are built on truth, not need. Amen to that. As Hank's taillights disappeared down the county road, Earl remained on the porch, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and approaching frost. Tomorrow, he'd start the process of healing, financial, emotional, spiritual. He'd visit Tommy's grave and thank his son for the protection that had saved his life. He'd attend church and face the community that had rallied around him. He'd begin the slow work of rebuilding trust in his own judgment. But tonight, for the first time in months, Earl Mackenzie felt truly safe in his own home. The trap was closed, the predators were caged, and the old soldier had won his final battle. 3 months later, Earl stood in the county courthouse as Judge Morrison read the sentencing. Richard Torelli, for your crimes of conspiracy to commit murder, elder fraud, and a pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple states, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Rick showed no emotion as the bailiff led him away in shackles. He'd aged 20 years in 3 months, the expensive clothes replaced by prison orange, the confident swagger reduced to the shuffle of a broken man. Linda's sentencing had come a week earlier, 25 years for fraud and conspiracy, with the possibility of parole in 15 if she testified against other criminal associates. She'd tried to catch Earl's eye during the hearing, perhaps hoping for some sign of the forgiveness she'd once counted on. Earl had looked through her like she was made of glass. After the hearing, Earl walked out into the bright January sunshine with Deputy Chen and his lawyer. How do you feel? Chen asked. Earl considered the question. Satisfied, not happy. Too many people got hurt for that, but satisfied that justice was done. The FBI recovered over $2 million from their previous cons. Some of that will go to victims' families, but there should be a substantial recovery for you too. Earl shook his head. Give my share to the other families. I've got everything I need. The drive home took him past familiar landmarks that felt different now. The church where Linda had first approached him, Mabel's diner where he'd watched her with Rick, the First National Bank where Tommy's safety deposit box had held the keys to salvation. Each place held memories that would always carry a sting, but they were his memories, in his community, part of his life's true story. At the farm, Earl found Hank waiting on the porch with a manila envelope. Mail from Tommy's kids, Hank said, handing over the package. Earl's grandson and granddaughter, now in college, had written regularly since learning about their grandfather's ordeal. Inside the envelope were their latest letters, along with something that made Earl's throat tight. A photograph of them standing beside a newly planted oak tree. Grandpa, we planted this tree at State in Tommy's memory, but also to thank you for protecting what he left behind. The plaque says, Thomas Mackenzie Memorial Oak, planted by his children in honor of his father's courage. We love you. Sarah and Mike Earl sat down heavily in his porch chair, the letter trembling in his weathered hands. Tommy's children would inherit the farm now, just as it should be. The legacy was secure. Good news? Hank asked, settling into the neighboring chair that had once been Margaret's, then Linda's, and was now just a place for friends. The best. Earl showed him the photograph. Tommy's grandchildren will go to college on land their father died protecting. His great-grandchildren will play in fields that have been in this family for 100 years. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the winter wheat fields stretch toward the horizon. The land looked peaceful under its blanket of snow, patient and enduring as always. You ever think about what might have happened if Tommy hadn't left you that evidence? Hank asked. Every day. But I've learned not to dwell on might-have-beens. Earl folded the letter carefully. Tommy's gone, but he's still taking care of his family. That's all any father can hope for. Speaking of taking care of family, Hank said with studied casualness, Dorothy's been wondering if you'd like to come to dinner Sunday. She's making pot roast. Earl smiled. Over the past 3 months, Hank and Dorothy had become the kind of friends he'd forgotten existed. People who cared without agenda, who showed up without being asked, who proved that authentic relationships were worth waiting for. Tell Dorothy I'll bring dessert. Apple pie, if I can remember Margaret's recipe. She'd like that. We both would. As afternoon faded toward evening, Hank headed home to help Dorothy with chores, leaving Earl alone with his thoughts and the gentle sounds of his land. A barn cat emerged from the equipment shed and wound around Earl's legs, purring with the contentment of a creature who knew it was safe and fed. Earl picked up the cat and scratched behind its ears, thinking about the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness was what he'd felt after Tommy died, a desperate hunger for any connection, even a false one. Solitude was what he felt now, peaceful, self-contained, open to authentic friendship, but no longer desperate for it. The phone rang inside the house, but Earl didn't rush to answer it. These days, his phone brought good news more often than bad, updates from Tommy's children, invitations from neighbors, calls from other elderly fraud victims who'd heard his story and wanted advice. When he finally went inside, there was a message from Pastor Williams inviting him to speak at a senior citizens safety meeting. Another from Sarah, his granddaughter, asking if she could visit during spring break. A third from Deputy Chen, updating him on a new elder fraud case where his testimony had helped secure an arrest. Earl smiled as he listened to the messages. He'd become something he'd never expected, a protector of other vulnerable people, a voice for those who might otherwise suffer what he'd almost endured. As he prepared his simple dinner, beef stew heated on the stove, cornbread from a mix, black coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, Earl thought about the strange turns his life had taken. He'd lost a wife to cancer, a son to accident, and nearly lost everything to greed and deception. But he'd also discovered reserves of strength he'd forgotten he possessed and learned that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the most important victories. Outside, the winter wind howled around the old farmhouse, rattling windows and testing the foundation his grandfather had laid in concrete and stone. But inside, Earl Mackenzie was warm and safe and surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a life well lived, photographs of family, letters from grandchildren, books worn soft with reading, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd fought his last battle and won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help others, new chances to honor Tommy's memory and Margaret's love. But tonight, Earl was exactly where he belonged, home. 6 months after the trial, Earl Mackenzie woke before dawn as he had for 60 years, but this morning felt different. Spring had come to Missouri with a vengeance. The wheat fields were green and promising, the oak trees Margaret had planted were budding, and Tommy's vegetable garden was ready for another season of tending. Earl made his coffee the old way, grounds in a percolator, strong enough to wake the dead. As steam rose from his cup, he walked out onto the porch and settled into his chair to watch the sunrise paint the fields gold and amber. The morning air carried the smell of fresh earth and new growth, the sound of meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, and the distant rumble of Hank's tractor starting another day's work. In his shirt pocket, Earl carried 2 letters that had arrived yesterday. One was from his granddaughter Sarah, now studying agricultural economics and planning to return to the farm after graduation. The other was from a widower in Nebraska who'd heard Earl's story and needed advice about a woman who seemed too good to be true. Earl would answer both letters today, as he answered all the letters that came from people who'd heard his story. Sarah's letter would get encouragement and promises of guidance. The Nebraska widower would get honest counsel about trusting instincts over loneliness, about the difference between authentic care and practiced manipulation. He'd become something unexpected in his later years, a teacher, a protector, a voice for those who might otherwise lose everything to predators who fed on grief and isolation. It wasn't a role he'd chosen, but it was one that gave meaning to what he'd survived. The church bells began ringing across the valley, calling faithful people to Sunday worship and Sunday dinners and Sunday conversations on front porches just like this one. Earl would go to church this morning, as he had every Sunday for 60 years. But now he went as a man who'd learned the difference between faith and hope, between community and mere company, between love and need. Pastor Williams had asked him to speak to the congregation again next week about protecting the vulnerable, about watching out for neighbors, about the responsibility that came with surviving what others might not. Earl would say yes, as he always did, because he'd learned that wisdom unused was just another form of selfishness. A red-winged blackbird landed on the porch railing and fixed Earl with one bright eye, as if taking his measure. Earl nodded to the bird with the solemn courtesy he showed all living things these days. He'd learned to pay attention to small visitors, small kindnesses, small moments of beauty that revealed themselves only to those patient enough to notice. In the distance, he could see Hank and Dorothy's farmhouse, smoke rising from their chimney, their own morning rituals beginning. Good neighbors, authentic friends, the kind of people who proved that not everyone in the world was hunting for something to take. They'd share Sunday dinner later, and Dorothy would fuss over Earl's appetite, and Hank would want to discuss crop rotation or the weather or anything except the loneliness that no longer defined Earl's days. The coffee was exactly right. Strong and bitter and honest, like all the best things in life. Earl raised his cup toward Tommy's grave, visible in the distance beyond the oak grove, and spoke the words he said every morning now. "Thank you, son, for watching over your old man, for teaching me that love doesn't end with death, and protection doesn't stop with the grave." Then Earl Mackenzie, survivor of war and betrayal, protector of family legacy and community values, settled back in his chair to watch another day begin in the place where he belonged, surrounded by the love that had never left and the wisdom that had come at such a dear price. Some battles are worth fighting, some victories are worth the cost, and sometimes being alone is just another word for being free.